Okay, hi, I'm Dan Cohen, and I want to introduce you to Clif Perkiser. Clif was at Intel, if you can't do the math here, for 16 years. He started as in product marketing for the 386 processor. He spent, I think, most of the 90s and until he retired from Intel in the corporate marketing group. And I had the pleasure to work with Clif during that time. And his last role was in running Intel.com operations. In 1999, he decided to take a year's leave to Hawaii and then decided he wanted to stay there. And the story, Clif, I heard was when you came back, a lot of people, the stock was really high. The stock had, people had retired. Your direct management team was gone. So you couldn't figure out who to resign to. Is that true?
Yep, that's true. I finally found Jamie, who was, I think, head of corporate marketing, Jamie Dover, corporate marketing, and she took my my official resignation letter. So, but it was weird to be back to Intel a year after being gone for a year for that day.
So, so tell us a bit about, you know, why did you choose Hawaii, and you know, what was it like leaving Intel and moving from California to Hawaii?
Well, the answer for Hawaii was actually pretty straightforward. I mean, what's not to like about the place, right? The weather is, it's 80 degrees, it's 85 degrees here. We have no forest fires. So I hate to be mean to you guys, but that is kind of one of the reality of it is lovely here. There's definitely some issues. And
I guess it was kind of a dumb question on my part, why you moved to Hawaii.
My all of my vacations were to islands. I mean, they were like Caymans, Martinique, Tahiti, Australia, which I know isn't actually an island, but it kind of feels like it. And I also had a sister had moved here a year or two earlier, and so that was a thing. It was kind of scary because I really had no network here, and it's a rather insular place, so it was kind of hard to make friends because there's no work environment or something like that. But I very much have enjoyed it. About a quarter of the people that move here, or a third, get island fever. That's just never something that's been happened to me. It's been a great launching place for me to go off, and I've now gotten my tropical island count up to a little over 2 dozen. Hawaii Islands are not always the prettiest, but they're among the prettiest. Okay, you want me to start?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So let me just kind of briefly go through the agenda. I want to spend a bit of time talking about my experience as a regular volunteer, and then discuss some problems that I had personally with volunteering. We'll spend the bulk of the time talking about sort of the 2 boards I'm on, the one that I probably spend the most time on, and probably most proud of my work, which is specific historic parks, which I'll explain a little bit later what that does. And then I want to spend some time and get some feedback from the alumni on what I think a technology savvy person from Intel can do to help nonprofits. And so that'll be how we wrap up. So why I volunteered, as Dan alluded, I was a 40-year-old retiree, and as Dan said, when people in the Valley talk, you don't actually use the word retiring. Certainly for the first 5 years, I was a consultant. I was all kinds of other things, taking a sabbatical, pausing. If I could have found a great job at Hawaii, I probably would have taken one. But what I quickly determined that Hawaii is a great place to live and a okay place to work, whereas Silicon Valley is a great place to work and a good place to live. So for me, I wanted to be able to give back to the community. I think that's important. Particularly in Hawaii, there aren't many great jobs, so many people work two or three jobs sometimes, and there just isn't a large source of volunteers. There's a selfish reason. I just wanted to learn more stuff about areas I was passionate and interested about, and then, as I mentioned, I didn't have a network of friends, so volunteering was sort of a way for me to socialize, get out of the house, get myself off the computer, because I could be on the computer anywhere in the world, but why do it in Hawaii? I still spend too much time on the computer, but that's okay. So let's talk about, so I just counted up this morning. I ended up exactly at a dozen significant volunteering things where I spent more than a month or two. And I've narrowed the 12 down to 2 in the interest of time. The first one is Hanauma Bay Nature Preserve. This, I imagine many people who've been to Hawaii have been here. So this is the premier snorkeling spot in Oahu. About 1 million people come here. There would be more, but the state of Hawaii actively discourages people for reasons of conservation. This top picture is a view from my office. As I often would say, the pay sucks, but boy, the office environment is nice. The job basically consisted of talking to tourists, giving a little introduction to nature conservation, yelling at them to please not stand on the coral because you're going to kill it. And then the fun part of the job was we had, I don't know, probably 2/3 of the people that come here had never snorkeled before. And there's really an excitement when, oh, wow, look at the giant fish in front of me and it's so pretty and clear. And the kids were all excited about it. The guys would come up and they would say, are there sharks here? And I would say, yeah, there's one over here. And for the most part, I'm being sexist, but it's kind of true. For the most part, the young girls would come up and they'd go, where are the sharks? And every once in a while, somebody would pull a fast one, and a young girl would want to see the sharks, and the boy would be terrified. But it actually worked often. I really did enjoy the job, but there were some real issues with the park as itself, which I'll get into a little later. I spent 8 years there, so obviously I didn't. I really did enjoy it. The second position is my other passion, which is history, and that was as a tour guide for the USS Missouri. This one didn't last as long for reasons I won't go into, but basically I was a docent. There are actually a couple Intel alumni I took their kids on this ship as a tour guide, and it was good exercise. The ship's 1,000 feet or roughly back and forth, so you do about a mile when you do a tour. And there's plenty of ladders or stairs, as we civilian call them, to go up and down. With my background in World War II, I found it really interesting. Lots of fellow volunteers had a very interesting background. So they were both good experiences and fairly representative of the volunteer stuff that I did. The other areas of volunteer stuff I did, which is I'm sure similar to lots of people in Silicon Valley, is I spent a lot of time working with startups here in Hawaii as a mentor, writing a number of checks, working with the Hawaii Angel groups quite extensively, and then a few political campaigns. So my general problem I had with volunteering is it was sort of this learning curve, and I would spend, the first 2 ones I showed you, Hanauma Bay and Missouri, had a very good training program. You spent roughly a couple of months, like half days or sometimes a full day on Saturday, and they would go over quite a bit of detail, what you needed about the history of the ship or the fish you would see in Hanauma Bay, what you could and could not say, for legal reasons and all kinds of other reasons, and some tips about how to do a good job storytelling. So I found it to be interesting training for the most part. And then I would pretty much master the job after 6 months. I really literally would run out of new questions after 6 months. I mean, well, I'd love to talk about the fish in Hanauma Bay. The most frequent question I got was, where is the bathroom? And it's that way, we would point. So there was a lot of challenge or variety I found to many of these jobs. And another issue I found, not all organizations, but many, the volunteer coordinator is an entry-level position, and they have a rather strict job, which is to assign volunteers to times. And if they can't get a volunteer, to call up and get them. And they have a rather narrow box about what kind of skills they want or what they want you to do. And it's really kind of a mismatch. You've got people who are, running corporations, may have been professors, and they're put in a rather narrow box of what they should and shouldn't say. And so that kind of bothered me as a waste of human capital, if you will. And in addition, especially at Hanauma Bay, there was a lot of issues with the park itself. In fact, there was a bit of a scandal which was uncovered by a volunteer where the state had a pool of money that had to be spent at Hanauma Bay, but was finding creative accounting ways of diffusing it to other organizations. So I really was looking for a higher level involvement, and that is kind of led me to looking for a board. And I had a similar problem, I think many of you do. How do you get involved with the board? I didn't have a fancy title, and I didn't have a big network. So how I got involved with PHP actually goes back to 2001. December 7th, 2001, is the 60th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor of December 7th, 1941. And it was also 3 months after 9/11. So there was a lot of discussion and a lot of hype about, well, you know what, 9/11 is our second Pearl Harbor. And so when we had the Pearl Harbor survivors met in Honolulu that year for their annual activity, and because it was the 60th, there was a lot of interest. This gentleman here, so my answer to the PHP was one ship and one man. The guy is named Chief Petty Officer Robert Duncan, the late Robert Duncan. He was the father-in-law of one of my best friends, and he served on board this ship, the USS Tennessee, which was at Pearl Harbor on December 7th and suffered a fairly major bomb hit. In fact, if it had been about 10 miles, not 10 miles, if it had been about 10 feet away from where it landed, it would have blown up the magazine that just happened to the Arizona, and none of this story would have happened, right? So he went, and I spent about a week with Pearl Harbor survivors, and at the time, these gentlemen were in their late 70s or early 80s, and they were still pretty spry. Their memories were good. I'm sure they embellished their war stories a little bit, but by and large, they were great people to talk to. And the only time I've actually been involved where there were more survivors and more World War II vets than there were next generation people to listen to their stories. So that is kind of the history of my involvement. But the issue was when I went to talk to about volunteering at either Pacific Historic Parks or the Park Service, the actual volunteer jobs were really not interesting. They essentially consisted of sitting out in front of a bookshop with a donation jar saying, "Hi, how are you? Would you like to donate money?" And actually to do that for 4 hours was something I had zero interest in. So when I got a chance to be on the board, I really jumped at it. And it was serendipitous. A friend of mine that I had known from Hawaii Angels, his wife was on the board. She was a retired captain, which is the equivalent of a colonel in the Army or Air Force. And she had served on the board, and they were kind of looking for some non-military people to be on it. And so they interviewed me, and we generally do accept people who get nominated. And I joined in 2011. Okay. So let me talk briefly about my thoughts on nonprofits, and I encourage those of you who are on nonprofits to, submit questions or answer some discussion about, how you got on a nonprofit and maybe your thoughts on it also. We'll do that later on in the talk. But the things I liked about it, number one, I liked having the bigger picture, not just a very narrow focus on fish or what happened in 1943 on a certain raid, but the whole direction for the organization. I very much enjoyed doing mentorships. I was a techie on the board by a long shot, and so anything that involved technology, I was quite a bit involved with, and working for some, folks who were younger generation. They had some knowledge about, how to use social media that I didn't, but I also had some marketing skills that they didn't, and that was kind of helpful. And I found that was very much true throughout the board members. We had a lot of guys that helped out, train some of the junior marketing guys how to become better marketing people. I also, my board members are some of my best friends, and we all shared a passion for the mission of educating people about the history of World War II and Pearl Harbor and the other parks we serve. some things that people won't like about it, I suspect. There's a lot of meetings involved. There's no two ways about it. A board meeting is kind of the function of a board. And there are also committee meetings. And much like management in any organization, certainly in Intel, your output is measured not by what you do, but how you can help others do their jobs. So if you miss that hands-on opportunity, it's, that's probably a downside. And finally, one of the things I didn't know when I got on the board, but I spent a lot more time than I ever wanted to, is working with HR issues. When an issue gets brought up to the HR level, it always involves a senior person, the CEO or the HR manager, or in one case, another senior employee. And it's not an easy position for a board member to have to deal with. So those are things. So now let me move on into Pacific Historic.
Cliff, why don't we take a pause here,
okay,
for some questions. I'll take some from the chat pod, but I'd also like to encourage some questions from the audience in two areas. One is just if you have questions around how to get on a nonprofit board, and I know Cliff talked about basically it was through his network and knowing somebody on the board, but there can be other ways. But people have questions if you're interested in exploring that. We'd love to hear questions on that. And secondly, if you're currently on a nonprofit board, if you'd like to share your experience on getting on it and how you got on it and what that's been like, we'd be happy to hear that too. We do have a question from Mark Jadell that I'll share while people are putting more questions into the chat pod. And the question is, if you can describe a time when you've found your sense of humor and sarcasm helpful and not helpful on a nonprofit board. And you could share, were there any thoughts that you had in your head that you chose not to verbalize?
My ability to censor myself is not real good. So yes, I have been overly sarcastic, and I've gotten, Hawaii in general is a very non-Intel kind of place. It's a highly Japanese, the largest ethnic group in Hawaii is actually Japanese. I think they're 28% of the population, and they beat us Howleys by a few percent. So sarcasm isn't always really rewarded, that's for sure. On the other hand, I do manage to lighten the board up a lot, especially when we're serious issues. So I guess that's the pros, and the cons are, I know I've offended people that I didn't mean to offend. But honestly, I would say also, probably worse than that is just constructive confrontation. It took me many years to really unlearn some of the stuff I learned at Intel, because it just isn't as appropriate. Nonetheless, I don't regret the times. I don't think there's more than one or two times where I was confrontational, where I didn't think it was really important to be so. So I guess that hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, that's great. We have another question from John Raftree, which is around expectations on being on the board of a nonprofit. And are you supposed to either raise money or donate money from yourself?
Yeah, I think I'll get to that a little later in some more detail, but essentially we have a rule in our nonprofit that you need to donate. All board members have to donate. Now, as the chair of the development committee for Pacific Historic Parks, I just gave the speech to our board members, and I said, hey, you know what? Anywhere from $25 to $25,000 is fine. And so, obviously, there are plenty of boards though where you need four figures in order to really even be on the board, I think. So that is an expectation, and it varies by board. And as far as the time commitment, we laughingly say it's we're expected to go to a 3-hour board meeting and one committee meeting a quarter. And there are some people on the board who just do that. I'd say a good third of us do many hours a week, and another third do many hours a month. So that's kind of the range. And from what I understand, for people in Make-A-Wish and also on the boards for Missouri, USS Missouri, and the Aviation Museum, that's a fairly similar experience that they have. A third do what the minimum, a third do a lot more, and a third really make this almost a full-time job, or a part-time job, I should say, not full-time.
I can share my experiences. I've been on 3 nonprofit boards. The first one, it's a local organization helping low-income students, and basically to help them get to college and through college. And that was an issue I thought was really important. And there was a article in the local newspaper here, and so I just emailed them, and I met with the people that ran the board, and they asked me to join. And the nice thing was, I was working at Adobe at the time, and being a member of a nonprofit board, they would donate $10,000 a year to the organization. So if any of you are working at a larger company, you could check into whether there's that kind of opportunity. The other ones I've been part of, one is from my undergraduate school, and I went to a reunion and reconnected with somebody that was on the advisory council, and then met with the dean, and we hit it off, and then I was asked to join, and I'm currently chair of that. And the last one is this one, the Intel Alumni Network, and I had led a strategic planning exercise, and then was asked to volunteered maybe to join the board. I think the first one, I ended up leaving the board because I found what I really found meaningful was volunteering, mentoring one-on-one with the students. And the board meetings were, as Clif said, they were meetings. The agendas weren't super exciting to me. And the people who were on the board basically were all people that hadn't been in the workforce since they were in their 20s. And I didn't feel like I had as much connection with my life experiences with them in terms of the social part. So I stayed involved with the organization but left the board. So those are my experiences.
My other experience on the board is a fairly recent one. I've been a member of Hawaii Angels now for more than 12 years. I've been on the deal screening committee. I've served as a mentor for one of our accelerators. And it took me 12 years to get on the board, and that included a lot of work. But the reason was there was only 4 people on the board, and they eventually had to kick one of the guys off to kind of make room for me, because he just was not nearly as active as he, it was kind of a sad thing. He was not an active member, but he had been on the board, and he kind of liked just being on the board. And they finally had to graciously push him aside to make room for me and another person. So yeah. Anything else?
Why don't we have a short poll we'll launch into, and then we can continue on and hear more specifically about your organization.
Ah, good. Thank you. Yes, I appreciate running this. I'm anxious to see the results because I always have perceptions about what people do when they come to Hawaii. So I'm interested.
So what's your guess going to be before you see?
My guess is that most of the people on this thing will have gone to Hawaii, and maybe a third will have gone to the Arizona, and very few will have gone to it in the last 10 years. That's my guess.
Sounds like a good guess.
All right, moving on to Pacific Historic Parks as a organization. So you've now had plenty of opportunity to read the foil, so I can go over it quickly. I think the only the most important thing I want to highlight on the foil is that unlike most nonprofits where we are constantly fundraising, 90% of our revenue come from our bookstores and gift stores. And that is true for most of the park cooperating associations that work with national parks. We are one of the larger ones. We are on track to do $10 million in revenue, and we're profitable because we got our parks are often have a lot of visitors, and you know, once you're finished seeing the museum, you go into the gift store, you buy a T-shirt or a mug or a hat or a flag or something like that, and that's a pretty good business, all things considered. The board members are, as I mentioned, 2/3 military. There's only about 6 of us who are. I have a 2 years history in the United States Air Force Reserve in the ROTC program, but other than that, I'm counting myself as a civilian. And it's very military culture, and military culture and intel culture are not that dissimilar. You know, discipline in the military and discipline in intel are kind of the same thing. The difference is hierarchical. So that is something that kind of took me a bit of work to understand. And I'm not sure the military, the big issue it did come as the chairman for most of the time I've been there. He was very much, you know, I'm the chair, I'm kind of the super CEO, and we clashed with, my guesses were quite good, weren't they?
Yeah, I guess looks like
more of you been than I thought. Great.
More have been there.
Yeah, that's good.
So Cliff, how did, to the earlier question, how did your sarcasm work with the military brass?
Oh, that was fine. Oh, the military is way more sarcastic than we are. Oh, God,
okay.
Yeah. They're super cynical. Yeah, when you're getting shot at, man, you know, dark humor really is a coping mechanism. So no, that wasn't a problem. Challenging the hierarchy, that was an issue, but the sarcasm, not a problem. And the other thing I should say, and I feel very fortunate, the military is one of the most respected organizations institutions in the country, and it's for a good reason. They basically get their stuff done. It works well. I mean, it may not be very efficient, but you know, I grew, my appreciation for the military was already fairly high, but working around these colonels and generals and so forth, you know, they don't get these stars and such by accident. It's a merit system, quite a well-run merit system in general. One last thing I want to mention, because it's so important, is our revenue went down by 98% from February down to April. It's recovered a tiny bit, and our head count went from 80 down to 20. And this has been really, really painful. I went through a couple layoffs at Intel as a manager, and those were, you know, 5%. That's, you know, cutting 5% isn't nearly as hard as cutting 75%. And that's been probably the hardest thing in the last few months for me, because they're mostly really some good people. Why am I not? Yeah, there we go. So on to the picture show. I promised the next few slides will have almost no words on them. This is the iconic picture of the Arizona Memorial at night. We have a great social media team, so they got thousands of pictures. So almost none of these pictures are ones I've taken. There's about 1.8 million visitors that come to the USS Arizona Memorial. This is aboard the memorial right now. Obviously, some of them are more famous than others. That's Prime Minister Abe on the far left. He was here in 2016 for the 75th anniversary, but unfortunately not December 7th, along with President Obama. The man on the right is Admiral Harrison. He was the commander-in-chief of the SINCPAC fleet, which basically command of all the Pacific. It's literally the military for all of the U.S. and all of its allies for half the world. He is now the ambassador to South Korea, and a very interesting guy. One of the number 4 stars I've got a chance to meet as a board member, including the previous General Dunsforth, who was Commandant of Marine Corps and the Joint Chiefs of Staff under Trump up until just recently. And before that, Admiral Mike Mullen was the Joint Chief of Staff for both Presidents Bush and Obama. So
So you took this picture?
No, I did not.
Okay.
No, none of these pictures I took. I can't take a picture this good. There are one of the things we really have certainly done since I joined the board in 2010 and 11 is a huge focus has been on the survivors. I mean, it's a growing number. 1,177 people died on December 7th out of a complement of about 1,800. The remaining 600 now have all died except for 2 survivors. The 2 gentlemen you see in this picture were not on the Arizona one. This guy was on Pennsylvania, and I don't remember the other guy. But they both have passed away since this picture was taken just less than 4 years ago. And that's been an ongoing problem with this organization, is that we realize that the draw for the media, of course, is these cool 95-year-old guys who are still with it and can talk, and that's the media just loves to interview these people, the greatest generation and so forth. But as they pass away, we're very much concerned that the media's interest is going to also pass. The second park we have is Diamond Head State Monument. Diamond Head is the big volcano you see in all the pictures of Hawaii. It's primarily an outdoor exercise park. You climb up the umpteen hundred stairs and you've got a beautiful view of it, but there's actually quite a bit of history, and that's part of the reason when the state approached us. This is not unlike the Arizona, which is a federal national park. This is a state park, and they approached us to help, provide some funding for them. We run a little tiny kiosk, basically not much bigger than a hot dog stand, and we do almost $1 million a year worth of business. And again, the state gets a good chunk of that money to help do some educational programs and explain this is more than just a pretty place to walk up, that there's both Native Hawaiian history that's associated with this. It was a sacred location for the Native Hawaiians, as well as a military base that protected, they had military artillery in here to protect Pearl Harbor from an attack by the Japanese. Obviously, the Japanese carriers were hundreds of miles away, so these guns never were used. But that's one of our most recent ones we've taken over. Now we're moving from Oahu to Molokai, which is the second least populated island in the state of Hawaii. I think it's about 3,000 people. In the 1870s, leprosy came to Hawaii, and King Kamehameha established a leprosy colony here at Kalaupapa. As you can tell, it's a very, very pretty. I mean, even I'm somewhat jaded to the beauty of Hawaii after living here for 20 years, but even I kind of went, wow, this is really a gorgeous place. So it's not a bad place to be a leper. But again, like the survivors, there are, I believe, 5 patients from, at one point, there were hundreds, maybe even 1,000 patients in the 1800s. So we've got 5, and there's a staff of about 20 state health employees and 30 national park rangers kind of devoted to this. I don't know what happens when the last patient dies, but this is one of the parks that we've taken on that we never can make money on because there's only a handful of visitors who come there. But we try to support the education program that goes with this, and the maintenance and the preservation of the history that's associated with this place. Now we're going about 2,800 miles west to Guam, which is also about a 3-hour plane flight from Tokyo or most of Japan. Guam is a U.S. territory. It's where America's day starts over the international date line. A very pretty little island. This was a U.S. territory, and it was invaded very early in the World War II by the Japanese. They had many atrocities, and there was a very fierce resistance movement in Guam by the native Timorans to resist the Japanese. It was liberated in late '44 by the American Marines and Army, and we've got a nice little memorial visitor center that talks about the battle, that talks about the history of Guam, and very educational, very pretty little setting. Unfortunately for us, it's not a very well, it's not a very, it's not in a location that attracts a lot of traffic. So we have some issues with this one being profitable. And the last park, this fifth park, is the American Memorial Park in Saipan. Now, Saipan is about 200 miles from Guam. And it was also, unlike Guam, this was a territory that the Japanese administered after World War I. So most of the population in Saipan were Japanese. This was liberated by, or not liberated, it was invaded by the United States in early 1945. And had a rather tragic scene where the Japanese had told the civilians that if the Americans came, they would basically kill or rape them all. So a large number of them committed suicide in one of the more tragic events of World War II by leaping off a absolutely beautiful cliff. So again, this is this park, on the other hand, is right in the center of town and gets a lot of traffic. And a hurricane, sorry, not a hurricane, a typhoon. We had two typhoons hit this place. One in 2018 called YouTube, that was 175 miles, and it leveled the place, which is really unfortunate because of the 20-odd tropical islands I've been to. This is certainly in the top 3 of the most beautiful ones. But PHP actually, we sort of stopped our merchandising activities and shifted into full mode for relief efforts. And FEMA was there, but not, FEMA's gonna be slow. And we had guys that knew how to ship water and supplies and tents, both to our employees and to the people on. And because we're right in the center of town, people would come and pick up our relief packages. And it was one of our more feel-good events that I was happy to participate in.
Hey, Cliff, we'll need to pick up the pace a little bit to have enough time here.
Okay. All right. Well, good. We are closing in. So my last couple of slides actually are what I've done as a technology guy. Education, as I mentioned, is one of our focuses. Actually, when I joined the board, believe it or not, back in 2011, we actually were doing teleconferences with survivors and schoolrooms back in Omaha and Kansas City and places like that. Of course, it's certainly a lot easier with Zoom. You don't need to have a fancy teleconferencing facility. So we actually started doing Zoom with high school kids a year ago, where we'd go and we just show them what the park looks like. It's been very educating, very rewarding. We actually have an ongoing program where we do talks about every 2 weeks, and they range from everything from the experiences of a 10-year-old in Hiroshima to Japanese internment camps, to the weapons of attack that were used for Pearl Harbor, to the experiences of civilians here in Oahu when growing up in Oahu during the war. So it's been, and I've helped out a little bit on that on the technology, but by and large they've kind of done it by themselves. One area I spent a lot of time on is virtual reality. Now, in the 75th anniversary, as I mentioned, was 2016, and it was a big deal for our organization. We started planning for this in January of 2015, so almost 2 full years ahead. And we wanted to do something that was beyond just speakers and slides and books and stuff. That we wanted to hit the next generation. So a guy that worked for the chairman's old firm had a real passion for doing VR, and he sort of convinced us that VR would be the right thing. I cautioned the organization. I said, there's leading edge and bleeding edge, and companies like Adobe and Apple and Intel and Google, they can do bleeding edge stuff, but we as a nonprofit shouldn't. And unfortunately, my counsel was not entirely taken, but maybe it was a blessing in disguise. Well, we had a ridiculous budget, well over $1 million, to do a VR project, and it was not successful. And it was not successful for kind of all the reasons that software projects go wrong. And the good news is, after a few months of foundering, I convinced the board that we had to hire a CTO, and I helped recruit the CTO, and he took over, and he managed to get this project down to a reasonable level and cut our losses, if you will. But by and large, we threw it all away, and replaced it about 3 years later, with a second generation VR. And as I had told the board, if we just wait a few years, this is going to be a lot cheaper. The problem is we couldn't wait because we only had 175th anniversary. And so our second generation has been 1/10 the cost and much better. And I'm just going to give a little demo what that looks like now. Okay.
Very nice.
Come back. Why is it? Oh, back.
So while you're doing the technical stuff, we have a question from Howard Jacob about whether you were mentioning that there were very few survivors from the Pearl Harbor attack, and was there any oral history project that was done to preserve the memories?
Howard. That's a great question. And why am I having troubles here today? All right. Yes, we have in fact 800. The other project I've been involved in on a peripheral basis is we've done 800 oral histories, about half of them including video, of survivors. And we, in the last year or two, have placed them up on the website. And my ultimate goal is to have a process where we work with somebody like Ancestry or 23andMe or other apps like that. And you walk into the park and you kind of tell them who you are, and they say, hey, this person went to your high school and here's his history. And, or, oh, this is your great uncle, great uncle, and he served on board the West Virginia or whatever. And let really customize the experience, both for on-site people and probably more realistically for off-site people. Yeah, I mean, one of the differences between the National Park Service and PHP is the Park Service is all great about preserving the history. They're fantastic about getting everything and putting it in a thing. The area where they fall short of is marketing in that and making it more accessible to the population alive. And that's been my, I basically say an archive locked in a museum really doesn't have a lot of value as opposed to one that, 100,000 people can see. So I was rather proud. I think we reached more than over 100,000 people have gone to that VR tour that I showed you. And so that's been a real success for us. And it's actually now making money after our sunk cost. Now, my final slide is that I want to encourage Intel employees to think about helping out a park. Every national park out there has a PHP. There's a cooperating association for 800 parks overall in the country, and that includes not only national parks, but national forests, Bureau of Land Management, the Corps of Engineers, all kinds of organizations in the government have little parks, and they have cooperating associations. They're friends of the park. They, there's a very strict code of conduct and how they work. There's pros and cons. The pro is you generally get access to lots of government material. The cons is it's a permission system where the government has approval of everything from every T-shirt we put in the store, every book we publish has to get sign off by a government employee, which can be slow, but that is unfortunately, luckily, the job of our executive director and our staff, and not the board of directors. I think that Intel alumni can be super valuable in this stuff. My experience in going to the conference with these nice people is that they're very much passionate about their mission. In most cases, ecologically oriented. They're outdoors people, not history people like me. And by and large, as you said, Dan, with your board, there are people who don't really have a lot of business experience. There are plenty of exceptions, especially in a larger park like Grand Canyon or Yosemite or Yellowstone. But we're almost always short of is technology sophisticated. They know that kids are no longer that excited about going to see a geyser because they can see 25 geysers on YouTube. Why do I need to go to the Yellowstone to see one? I can see it on YouTube. And sort of convincing them that there's more to it than they can catch on YouTube is something that I think parks in general really need. And these friends groups are sort of desperate for people to help them guide on the technology because, left to their own devices, if an organization goes out and talks to a IT consulting firm, they will get a very expensive proposal and not a lot of guidance on not being upsold, I think. And my final comment is I think constructive confrontation is something that a lot of boards can use, and I would say appropriate, probably dialed back 2 or 3 notches from the Intel level of constructive confrontation. No yelling, in other words. Okay, so that's it for me. You can really help PHP specifically by donations. Did I mention our revenue, we're down 98%? Well,
yeah.
I will again follow us on Facebook. The Zoom talks are free of charge until I can figure out a way to make money on them. One of my projects is to figure out how we can make money on the Zoom talks. And finally, we are in the process of doing of relaunching our e-commerce platform, which has failed. And getting proposals, and I'm not an expert on the subject. So if any of you would be willing to take a look at some of these proposals and give me some insight, I would very much value the help. So do that. And then finally, I'm going to turn over to Dan. And now a word from our sponsors.
So for those of you that are interested in joining a nonprofit board and you'd like to get experience, the Intel Alumni Network is a great opportunity to get involved at any level of time commitment, any type of events that you'd like to be involved in. And if you do a good job on those, to join the board and get some board experience that you could leverage elsewhere. So we welcome everybody on this call and anybody else you might know from Intel to get involved. I want to mention that Susie is going to post these slides, so some of the links were put in the chat pods, but we'll get everybody the slides. Did have another question for you, Clif. So it sounds like the museum, just that the experience has really been upgraded in the last several years. So it's a good excuse for people to go back to Hawaii to check that out.
Unfortunately, you can't come back until COVID situation gets resolved, but maybe certainly by 2022 and hopefully sometime in 2021. Yes, please come back. We love tourists. Well, I love tourists. A lot of Hawaiians don't, but I do. Yeah.
And can the museum make it? I mean, with the 98% reduction, if things go on for another year?
Wow, that is the question we are struggling with. The good news is I'm on one of the committees I'm on is the investment committee. We basically, and we had a decent size. We had actually almost a year's revenue in the bank. That's obviously dropping. I think our current burn rate will keep us alive for a year, maybe two. But if it doesn't pick up by 2022, I don't know if we'll survive. Honest answer, sadly.
That is sad.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we do have opportunities if people want to apply donations there to help it out. Just do a quick check if there are any final questions. I think that was it. I just want to thank Susie DeLine for really driving all the logistics for this. Howard Jacob, who played a big role. And I want to thank Clif for sharing his time with us and sharing his experiences. And thanks everyone for attending. Clif?
I want to thank Howard for inviting me to do this. I was more than a little intimidated to have to follow in Bill Davidow's footsteps. And very much thanks, Dan, for walking me through the process, and Susie for all the logistical help.
And Clif, you had a good attendance and people didn't drop off in the middle, so you must have done a good job.
Okay, great, thank you.
He did do a good job, thank you. And I like the slide presentation as well.